So we talked about sourcing software. Now let's talk about package managers, which is the easiest way to install software. So there are two sets of command line programs for package management, and they're really two of them because there's two main distros of Linux, right? Red Hat and Debian based. In Red Hat based distros, you're going to use RPM or DNF or Yum. But RPM is the primary package manager, but then there's utilities on top of that. We'll talk about that. And in Debian, it's Debian Package Manager, a DPKG, which you use the app set of utilities with as well. But the difference between using RPM and dpackage versus DNF and apt is that RPM and dpackage are just for installing the packages, right? It's for extracting what's in that package, and that's all it will do. It doesn't, it understands dependencies, but it will not ensure those dependencies for you. It'll just tell you that, hey, you're missing a dependency. So also, you have to get the packages yourself when you run RPM or dpackage. So if you have the package from a developer, you can use RPM or dpackage to install it. If you're missing dependencies, you'll have to go and obtain those dependencies as well. There are many times where we need to install using packages as opposed to using one of the utilities that we'll talk about. But the utilities like DNF and apt or Yum are much easier to use because it automates a lot of this. So you don't have to worry about the getting the packages. You don't have to worry about making sure you have the right architecture and all that sort of thing. And you don't have to worry about the dependencies. All of that will be sorted out for you automatically with these package managers. So definitely an improvement. We'll start with RPM. So RPM is for Red Hat. And you download the file. You download a repository, right? You might have gotten this from some website. The developer might have sent you a link, or you found it somewhere like on SourceForge or something like that, right? An open source repository or GitHub or wherever you downloaded that repository from. You're going to copy that somewhere onto your system, and then you're going to follow the instructions to run the RPM command to extract that package and have it install. There's a good chance if you download a package, the first time you try to run RPM, it's going to fail, and it'll fail either because it doesn't have a certificate, it's not a signed certificate, or it's missing some kind of a dependency or something like that. So you'll see, or maybe you got the wrong architecture, right? So if you're on a 64-bit system and you try to install an 32-bit or x86 architecture, that's going to fail. All right, so this is the example of how to run RPM. You're going to run the RPM command, pass some options, and then the package names that the command, by the way, is whether you want it to install or uninstall the package. And then you pass the path to the package that you want to install. That's basically it, pretty basic, but there's a whole bunch of options. I'll show you what those are. These are just from your textbook, so you can certainly go through these. You can use the man command to look at them as well. But these are some of the options that you'll have available when you're running the RPM command. So a lot of times your install with something like RPM, or if you're using dpackage, it's going to fail because of dependencies. This is probably the most common problem with trying to install these packages from using RPM, is a lot of these packages, a lot of programs that people write for Linux require dependencies that are other packages. And in many cases, you can't include those dependencies because they're owned by someone else. So, you rely on them, but you can't include them with your own package. So you have to tell somebody, hey, here's the dependent packages that you're going to need. Now that's easy enough. If you wrote a package and you know that it has 3 dependencies, that's fine. But what if one of those dependencies then has 3 more dependencies, and then one of those dependencies has a few more dependencies? And you can see how this gets ugly, right? You keep going deeper and deeper and deeper, and you've got more and more dependencies. This is where things tend to fall apart. You have a couple options with the RPM. With RPM, you can go and gather up all those dependencies and install those first. And as they fail, you can go and find more dependencies. This is the battle that you'll have when you're using RPM directly or dpackage. You can also ignore those dependencies. You can say, you know what, let me just see if this works without that dependency, right? Maybe it's a feature in the software that you're never going to use, so you don't really need that dependency. For example, sometimes applications support 4 or 5 different database engines, and it'll list all 5 databases as a dependency. Well, they're drivers. It'll list all the drivers for these databases as dependencies, but you don't need them all, right? You only need the one. So if you're only using Oracle, you can install that dependency, ignore the rest, right? Because you know you're never going to use MySQL, PostGre, Microsoft, or whatever, right? So you can ignore those dependencies. So lots of options there, but again, you have to figure all this stuff out as you go through this. So here are some of the options in dpackage, right? Very similar to RPM. It has a list of options. It's going to be the same issue, right? It's going to fail for dependencies. You have to go find them just like RPM. And again, here are some more options and commands for dpackage. So dealing with these dependencies is very frustrating. And why do people not really worry about this as much? Because very few people are using RPM and dpackage directly. Usually we're using something like Yum or DNF, which replaced Yum, or you're using apt and Debian-based distros. If you have an RPM-based distro, you're probably going to use Yum or DNF. By the way, in most systems, if you use the Yum command, it still works. Even if it's DNF, it just aliases it, right? And if you're using a Debian-based system, you're probably going to use one of the apt commands. So apt is not really a command, it's more of a suite of tools, and apt-get is the one you're going to use. That's the equivalent to using DNF or Yum to install packages in RPM. So very similar. They both pretty much work the same way. So with DNF, you're basically going to run the command, pass a few options in, tell it whether you want to install, remove, or update the package, and then you just give it the name of the package. Now, unlike RPM, so in RPM, the package name included usually the architecture, right? So it had the OS and architecture right in the package name because it was very specific. You had to run the package for your specific architecture, right? With something like DNF or apt-get, you don't have to do that. You just pass it the package you're looking for. In the example you see on this slide, we have Emacs. So if you're using RPM, you have to pass Emacs, the version number, as well as the architecture that you're using, all in the name of that package, right? You have to use the right package that matches where you're trying to install it. With DNF, you just use Emacs, right? It automatically knows, the package manager knows what your architecture is, and it knows what version you want because it's always the latest one, right? Although you can sometimes install older versions if you like, but you just run that. Now, what's cool about this command, whether it's apt-get or DNF/Yum, they will automatically get all the dependencies for you. So when it goes to install, it's going to say, oh, I found a whole bunch of dependencies. And some of those dependencies had dependencies. And it will list them all for you and say, hey, here's all the stuff that I have to install in order to install this package for you. And you have to hit Y to say, yes, I agree to install those packages. It'll tell you what size it is, right? How large the installation is going to be. And it does all the work for you. So it's all fully automated. So these are just some of the DNF commands, some of the commands you can use. So for example, most commonly you would be using install, but you can also use list, you can downgrade, you can check, and so forth. You can remove, right? So DNF maintains a list of all the repositories in the config file in Etsy, just like everything else. We have a config file in Etsy, and you can configure where it goes to look for dependencies and for packages. So you can point it to a repository. There are some cases where you have to point it to a different repository because the repository you're pointed at doesn't know about the package you want to install. I've had to do this many times where the developer's package just wasn't in one of the standard repositories, so they tell you to go use a specific one. A great example of that is if you're in Google, right? When you are running your virtual machine in Google or Azure or Amazon, a lot of times they have their own repository by default. So certain packages you try to install, their repository doesn't know about it. So you have to go put a different one in and then it works fine. And then sometimes you have to switch it back because there are some packages that are specific for Amazon or specific for Azure or for Google or Rackspace or whatever environment you're using that only exist in their repositories, right? So sometimes you have to, be cognizant of which repositories you have configured. But both package managers allow you to do this, whether it's DNF/Yum or apt-get. So here you're seeing an example of what it looks like if you're not using the -Y option when running DNF. So if you don't use -Y, it's going to prompt you and say, hey, here's all the stuff I need to install in order to install this package for you, and you have to hit Y to agree to it. If you use -F, is just going to assume that you want to install everything and it's not going to ask you. So you run the command, and as long as you didn't get any errors, the package that you tried to install is available and ready to use. And I can't stress enough how easy it is to run these package commands like dnf, yum, and apt-get. It's very user-friendly, very easy, almost too easy. So whenever I have to install a package in other ways, I cringe because now I got to do some work, right? And it's a pain in the neck. So apt is the version that we use on Debian-based distros, right? So dnf yum is what we use on RPM-based systems or Red Hat. And then if you're on a system that's based on dpackage, you would use the apt-get command. And it's very similar, works almost exactly the same way, very similar options. It has repositories just like yum and dnf. Now, all that said, if you wanted to use DNF on a Debian-based system, or yum or yum or DNF on Debian-based, or if you wanted to use apt-get on an RPM or Red Hat-based system, you could install that package manager. You can use the package manager in Red Hat to install the Debian package manager, and then use that package manager to install the utilities for that package manager. In theory, you could do that. I don't really know the advantage to doing that, right? Because usually the repositories for RPM are mostly going to have packages that are built for Red Hat-based distros, and the ones for Debian are going to be for Debian-based distros. So it's not common that you'll want to use the opposite, right? That's not very common. So these are just some of the commands available with apt-get. And finally, this is Aptitude, a screenshot of Aptitude, which is a menu-driven utility for apt-get. So instead of using the commands, you could you can use Aptitude. Now you'd have to install Aptitude first, so you use apt-get to install Aptitude, right? And then you can run the Aptitude command. It'll bring up this nice, pretty menu-driven user interface that you can use rather than using the commands.